Hi, first graders. Welcome to Bedtime Stories again. Sorry, I look like a mess. I just got back from taking my puppy on a run, and I was trying to decide what to read to you guys since we finished The Mouse and the Motorcycle. And I realized that we are wrapping up first grade, and that means that our time left together is limited before you guys go on to bigger and better things in second grade. And you're ready for that. But the last couple weeks, something that we would normally do if we were in school is we would start, or at least I would get to start to share with you all of my favorite things, because you have learned how to read and you have learned how to do first grade math. And so now it's sort of that time where I get to share with you all my favorite things before you go on to the awesome second grade adventure. So I decided to share with you an author that I love, once again, because when I was a little girl, my mom would read me these stories constantly. So the author is Robert McCloskey, and he wrote some amazing stories that are now classics. Two of them happen to be my favorites, which are the two that I'm going to read to you. And normally in May, we go to the farm. Of course, we can't go to the farm this year, but I know that at some point in your journey, you will get to go to the farm. I believe a lot of you went to the Smith family farm last year in kindergarten around pumpkin patch time. So I'm sure you'll see a farm in your future. This story happens to be about ducks. And ducks we can see anywhere when we go to a park or when we go to a pond. And it is called Make Way For Ducklings. So I want you to get cozy. There aren't colors in this book. And I think that that's one of the things that I love the most about it. The author and the illustrator are both Robert McCloskey, and I love his pictures. I love the details. I love his style, and his style was to not use color. So we all have our own style when we draw, so I want you to pay close attention to that too. Tonight I'm going to read you Make Way for Ducklings, and then tomorrow night you'll get to hear another favorite called Blueberries for Sal. Okay? So, Make Way for Ducklings. I love this. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live. But every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. I would definitely like that island. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer. But the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. So that big bird that they were talking about was the swan on the boat. It wasn't a real bird. I like this place, said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better? Good, said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But look out, squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. You'll get run over. And when she got her breath, she added, Oh, this is no place for babies with all those horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look somewhere else. Kids on bikes. So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. This is better, quacked Mr. Mallard. That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden. Yes, said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. That looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings. So now they're looking at that island. So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that, the Mallards called on Michael every day. There's Michael, the policeman. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, and then Lack, then Mack and Knack and Whack and Pack and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. I'll meet you in a week in the public garden, he quacked over his shoulder. Take good care of the ducklings. Oh, don't you worry, said Mrs. Mallard. I know all about bringing up children. And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." And before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they are, little ducklings in a row. There they waded ashore and waddled along till they came to the highway. Uh-oh. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns of the speeding cars. Quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other the way policemen do for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. There they go. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street, with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. There they are. Right on into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned round to say thank you to the policemen. The policemen smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. You see him over there on the island? The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. The end. So now, the next time you see a pair of mallard ducks, you can call them Mr. and Mrs. Mallard. And right now is the time where sometimes you'll see a little jack, mack, knack, whack, pack in the water, because this is the time that they do have their ducklings. And another fun fact about this story is if you ever go to Boston and you go to the public garden, there's actually statues there of Mr. and Mrs. Mallard and their ducklings, because this was such a famous story that was written a long time ago. It's a children's classic, and I believe it actually did win the Caldecott for Best Picture Book, or it was in the running for Best Picture Book. So I hope you enjoyed it, and tune back in tomorrow night for another Robert McCloskey story, Blueberries for Sal. I miss you, and I love you to pieces. And oh, good night, sleep tight, wake up bright in the morning light. Do what's right with all your might. Don't let the bed bugs bite. There's no place like home. Good night.